Hi, I'm Ellie Yell. I'm consulting lead of private equity, venture capital, and scale ups for People Edge and TPC leadership. Welcome to our People Pulse, which is our regular podcast exploring the intersection of private equity, human capital, and leadership. Today, I'm very pleased to introduce you to David Tanner. David is an independent board director with 28-year relationship with the leading private equity investment firm. He's been serving on private equity backed boards for over a decade. While he started his career as a chartered accountant, much of his career has been as an executive in private equity portfolio companies, leading transformation, restructuring, growth initiatives as roles as CEO, COO, president, and co-CEOs. He currently serves on two boards, one as the board chair and audit committee chair, and the second as audit chair and as part of the compensation committee. So welcome. Hi, David.
Hi, Ellie. Good to be here.
Great. Well, let's dive straight into talking about your current roles, if that's okay. What would you say are some of the challenges the businesses are facing that required your expertise to come in as chair?
Sure. I think the primary business I'm working with had a strong top line potential, but really lacked an organic growth strategy. And that was combined with sort of a founder led culture that lacked operating discipline and financial rigor. So, for example, forecasts weren't really reliable and decision making wasn't data driven. So there was a gap between strategy and execution. And my role was really to help bring some structure, clarity around performance, accountability, and critically a leadership team that could scale the business.
So you mentioned, some of the things you had to put in place there. Anything else that you really had to do to help drive the value creation in that company so far?
Well, I think critically, we focused on three or four things, typically, one of which is hiring a new CEO. That was kind of important in this particular case. But then building a discipline, a cadence around operating reporting, so that's monthly reviews, KPIs, and really establishing a culture of accountability. One of the other things that we had to do was really establish the finance organization, the CFO and the finance organization as a single source of truth or single point of truth. And then sort of next on the list is really upgrading the talent, the management talent where needed, because it's about execution against a strategy. You cannot do that without a team. It's not about one person.
Yeah. So I understand you needed to replace a number of those senior leaders then. Can you say any more about what drove that need for change and also then the process that you had to go through for sort of assessing and hiring that new executive talent?
Yes, I think important to point out that it's not necessarily that someone is kind of a good person or that they're not talented. It's a question of whether they're right for the next phase of the business growth. The business I'm talking about was founder led. And so what the private equity owners are looking for is a clear strategy. They want a long range plan and they're underpinned by solid business plans. And so what's important is that you've got to have a team that understands that and can run at that pace and with a clear strategy and strong operational plans and financial discipline. So we would look at the management team from the point of view of where there are gaps, where we felt that there were upgrade potentials, and then we would move as quickly as we could, respectfully, but important from the point of view of getting the team in place. Think of it as a crew in a boat. You need to get the right team in place as quickly as possible in order to begin executing against the strategy.
Can you say any more around the process that took in terms of how you went about identifying and assessing new talent?
Yes. So very, very important is to have clear roles and responsibilities and job descriptions. Said otherwise, a mandate for each of these positions. That's kind of at the core of matching people against the requirements of positions. And then what becomes important is identifying there could be people in network, or you may need to use recruitment firms in order to find, and I'm talking about the executive level, you use those to find the right people. But importantly, you've got to have a really good understanding and definition of what the roles are, what the expectations are for those roles, and a way to essentially score candidates against those expectations, right? So that you can have a data-driven decision-making process around finding the right people for the organization, for the team.
Yeah. And beyond interviews, did you use any other data points to help make decisions on executive hires, like psychometrics?
We did not. I wish we had, because I do believe in using tools, profiling tools and the such, to help identify the characteristics that you're looking for. So I think it's something that is underused, right? And is very valuable in this process.
Thank you. What other, say, human capital or cultural aspects of the business were you starting to uncover that was having an impact or challenge?
I think certainly being a founder-led company, there were certain traits, particularly around decision making, that were difficult to uncover initially through some of the diligence. I think we found that the leadership, the bench strength was not deep, and that we found the quality of decision making was not really data driven. There was a lot of intuition and kind of feeling from the founder-led founders about the business. So I think we found a lack of integration of finance and financial rigor in decision making. That was kind of clear. And I think ultimately as well, the culture did not really embrace accountability. So, and these are things which sometimes it's not very easy to find out when you're doing diligence or when the investors are doing diligence.
Yeah, yeah. So yeah, that decision making and accountability is really key up front. And looking back at that, any other specific human capital metrics or cultural markers that in an ideal world you would have liked to have caught during the pre-deal due diligence?
I think it's always interesting. We didn't have a lot of those kind of markers. I think what we were looking for was certainly characteristics in the management team. I think there are ways to uncover that from the point of view of looking at personal leadership, looking at accountability traits, and looking for evidence of that. I think importantly in how decisions are made in the business. That becomes very, very important. And it's not always easy to determine that from a fairly limited number of interviews with a limited number of people in the company. When you're looking at a company, you're tending to focus on the CEO and the C-suite. And sometimes it's difficult to really evaluate that next level, the bench strength of the leadership team.
Yeah, where you're needing to make decisions quickly, and often those processes can take a long time.
They can take a long time. And I think that is also forms very much part of kind of what happens in the first 90, 100 days is getting into conversations with deeper into the organization to understand kind of how decisions are made and how much data is used to drive those decisions.
Yeah. And if I were to push you slightly in an ideal world, if you had all data available to you at your fingertips, would there be some specific metrics that you would love to be able to have at the start of that journey?
I think it would be around, for example, understanding whether how accurate are their forecasts. That would be sort of a good one in terms of understanding how accurate are their forecasts as compared to actual over time, right? So how good are they at forecasting the business? And then what do they do once they've had kind of a result, right? From the point of view of essentially that feedback loop of, plan, do, check, act, that kind of framework in terms of they make a forecast, they have an actual result, and then what do they do with that result? How do they learn from that result? So I think forecasting accuracy would be one that would be very, very helpful to understand that. And also, if there was a metric to kind of value or kind of calculate how people do under how they perform under pressure from the point of view of when people are under pressure, that their natural state comes out, if you like, from the point of view of how they respond. And that becomes really important from the point of view of when things are not going well, how do they perform? Because that's sort of a measure of resilience, for example. That would be super helpful.
Yeah, I'm thinking almost that plays into psychometrics that cover sort of the dark side or risk profile of individuals when they're under extreme challenge or stressful situations, how those extremes of behavior might play out. It could be a really good addition at that point in the journey. So as chair, how do you act as that support for the CEO when at times they will face that intense and sometimes short-term pressure from the PE deal team?
So, Ellie, just to step back and understand the board's role is clearly to provide oversight for the management on behalf of the investors. That's what the board's purpose is there. The relationship between the chair and the CEO is somewhat special from the point of view of helping define and translate the expectations of the investors for the CEO. And that does create at times pressure for the CEO. But the chair role is typically supportive and essentially acts as a translator as well for expectations, and helps the CEO turn the investor expectations into something that's constructive, actionable for the team. That does mean sometimes filtering, but mostly support, while also maintaining a level of accountability for the CEO for performance in the business.
Thank you. Now you have a moment to think about this because it is a killer question, but in one sentence, what would you say is the single biggest people risk that kills a PE investment?
I think if I go back to the point that it's not that there are good or bad people, but it's right people for that phase of the business. I think that the people risk is that is if you have a business that depends upon a small number of individuals that cannot scale or don't have the capability to scale the leadership and the management of the business, because otherwise I think that's the biggest risk of underperformance is if you don't have leadership that can scale.
So it's both in the reliance on a few key people, but in the depth and breadth of that as well.
Yes. So if you have a business that depends on a small number of individuals that don't have that ability to scale, and behind that is a whole nother set of learning and development capabilities, right, from the point of view of individuals. But if you have a business that depends upon a small number of individuals that don't have scalable leadership and management capabilities, then the risk is the business will underperform.
Thank you. Thanks so much. So our People Edge human capital services are aligned to the 4 stages of a portfolio's company relationship with a private equity firm, from pre-deal through to the first 100 days, value creation and exit. So in your 28 plus years in and around PE, how often have you seen a deal underperform, not because the numbers were wrong, but because the leadership or culture wasn't ready for the scale?
So I would say I'm fortunate in my experience in that, in particular, the leading firm that I've worked with, this has been something they've recognized. So from the point of view of underperformance, it's not necessarily been kind of at a team level. There have been individuals that have underperformed. But I think that in general, I would, if I look at the industry, is that unfortunately it's more common than not that deals underperform. And from my perspective, it's primarily due to people issues or, problems, right? Because even if you have a fantastic strategy, it's all about the execution. And if you don't have, and that execution depends entirely on the people. And so I'd say that that leadership is absolutely critical and probably the primary cause of underperformance in the majority of situations.
And when looking at a founder-led business pre-acquisition, what would you say then are the top 3 non-negotiable traits that you would look for then to suggest that they can transition effectively into a PE-backed environment?
That's really interesting. I would say number one has to be coachability. If founders or leaders are not coachable, if they are not interested in learning and development, that's going to be a real problem, because the expectations change in a private equity backed business and you have to adapt, right? So coachability, I'd say, is number one. I would say with founders, in my experience, delegation is probably the next challenge from the point of view of a willingness to be able to delegate, because what has made them successful is in large part due to their own driving of decisions, operations, and so on. But in a larger organization, that doesn't scale. And so I'd say, a willingness to delegate is probably number two for me. Number three, I would say, is probably is using data. Is about data driven decision making becomes really, really important, because you're dealing with professional investors, professional board, and it's not about someone feeling good about something anymore. It's about show me the data, create a business plan. So I think there were three. Yeah. So those what I would say, sort of coachability, delegation, and data-driven decision making.
Brilliant. Thank you. Good summary there at the end. So standard due diligence often misses leadership risks, let's say, and some of the things that you just mentioned. What specifically then should investment committees be asking about the management team before they sign?
I think it's kind of particularly important in kind of founder-led businesses, but it's about, I would say, it's trying to understand and ask who's actually making decisions in the business. And again, this is not always easy to kind of uncover. And how do they make those decisions? So if you go back to what I just said about coachability and decision making, right? Data driven decision making. It's about understanding who's making those decisions and how they're making those decisions. That's really, really critical to understand. That tells you a lot about the management team and tells you about centralized decision making, or kind of how empowered the team is, right? I think another thing I would is that in looking at this is really important. It's not about their forecasts or their projections, but it's looking at their ability to forecast the business. That's really important, because that tells you whether they understand the unit economics in the business, whether they understand the drivers in the business from the point of view of revenue, markets, customers. So I think those are, sort of how the decisions are made, who makes the decisions. I always like to look at the forecast, because and kind of look at over time, how accurate are those forecasts, how good are they at predicting performance in the business. And then, often there's situations where performance has been missed, that they've not made their numbers. And that's really important to drill down. I'd say that's another area to really drill down on from the point of view of what actually happens or happened when they missed their performance, from the point of view of who did what as a result of the missed performance, right? From the point of view of this speaks again to kind of the resilience and the innovation of the team, from the point of view of how did they respond. If the response was simply to adjust the forecast down and just keep moving forward and hoping that things are going to get better, that tells you a lot about the business. But if there was corrective actions that came out of that, or if there were adjustments made, from the leadership of the business, then that tells you more about their ability to their resilience, their innovation, and their learning capability from the point of view of adapting to different situations. That's kind of those are probably the main areas.
Yeah, and what you just said there and about decision making also, yeah, then feeds into something you mentioned earlier around delegation being one of those significant factors that you'd love to be able to uh, better get a grip of and handle on early on. and that accountability piece as well that you mentioned.
Yes. And if you look at particularly founder-led businesses which have grown quickly, when something goes wrong, often it's not kind of a team response. The founder or founders will respond. And because decision making has been centralized, the leadership team is essentially in a situation where they're waiting for direction as opposed to working on problems together and innovating together, collaborating together. So again, that speaks to the next level of management from the point of view of their capabilities and their ability to scale to scale the business, which
Yeah.
is kind of scaling leadership at the same time.
Yeah. Well, that's a nice segue then into thinking about the first 100 days post deal. So how do you establish a productive sort of operating rhythm between the board and the management team in those critical first few months?
So what I found very helpful is to establish a monthly routine or cadence of reporting with the CEO and the management team. But typically there's kind of an adjustment because there's an adjustment period of adjusting to the private equity expectations around data driven planning and decision making and execution. And so those monthly reviews of plans, of KPIs or key performance indicators are really, really important because they set the expectations for the team in terms of what the board wants to see, what the board needs to see, because they're probably not used to that level of kind of data-driven reporting to the board and to the private equity investors. And there is, importantly, Ellie, to set an expectation around transparency for this reporting. This is sort of uncomfortable for a lot of acquired companies and their management teams because the private equity investors have an expectation that the board members are involved and often, like myself, operators who are very comfortable drilling down to find out root causes of problems or to understand how the business works. So establishing that board ready reporting structure, cadence, content, that's really, really important to establishing a sort of a rhythm of reporting where everyone knows what the expectations are. And so I've had lots of situations where there's one-on-one conversations with individual members of management team to help set those expectations around what the board is expecting needs and what the board is expecting to see. And that takes, that doesn't happen overnight.
Yeah, I'm sure. And yeah, and in that unique role as chair and with all those challenges, how do you ensure that the management team really gets on board and buys into this new thesis and new way of working?
So this is really important from the point of view of you want the management team committed. You want them to not just simply go along. You want them to buy into the plan. And so what becomes really important, Ellie, is that the management team needs to be involved in the development of whether it's a long range plan or whether it's a budget for the next year. The management team has to take ownership of that planning in order to be committed. So I think that there's a balance in there of kind of aspirational views of the business, and obviously the investors may have that, but it's got to be balanced with realism from the point of view of having the management team in particular sort of bought into and committed to the future vision and financial outcome that the investors are looking for. So it's about having building that trust with the management team of working together, right? It doesn't mean to say that the board and the board chair, they will challenge the management team on assumptions. They will challenge business plans and so on. But that's part and parcel of getting to the best answer and having a shared perspective of future performance and risk in the business. What are the key risks? So I think that's kind of really foundational to your question.
You mentioned sort of building trust there and the importance of building trust in that relationship. What would you say is one thing, you know, say to a new chair, one thing that they should do in the first, to build trust with the CEO, whether that's, existing or a new CEO, well, still maintaining that high accountability?
Yes. Well, yeah, you're speaking to the heart of how to build trust, right? And with a CEO, it's somewhat of a with the chair of the board in particular, it can be quite a unique relationship from the point of view of you have to have a deep level of trust. And so for me personally, that means that I have to. It goes back to kind of you do what you say, and so you deliver on your commitments, and you build trust, you earn trust, right? Over time, it just doesn't happen. You don't, I don't assume that I'm trusted. I have to earn that trust, and so you have to be consistent in kind of how you are dealing with the CEO, and the management team if you're dealing with them. But it comes from being fair, being candid, but also being predictable, right? From the point of view of you want the CEO to confide in the board chair from the point of view of the challenges they're facing. When I always tell CEOs that when you're in front of the board cares deeply about what's keeping them up at night. It's not about painting a rosy picture. It's about helping the board understand the risks in the business, what's worrying them, where the opportunities are. And so that requires building trust, which is around being fair, being consistent, being predictable. I think that's kind of how I look at it.
Great, thank you. Scale ups often have founder loyal teams. How do you distinguish between a team that is loyal to the past versus a team that is capable of building the future?
And so, Ellie, it'd be great if there was some kind of test that people could take for this without upsetting people. But I think this is really challenging from the point of view of trying to look at people and their behaviors. So there's a limit to how many people you can access before you buy a company. Once you own the company, now you have a chance to meet more people in the organization. So that becomes really critical in the kind of the first 90 or 100 days from the point of view of the board members in particular meeting with next level management below the executive team, maybe another level below that, potentially, depending on functions. But what you're looking for is you're looking at behaviors and you're trying to identify people that are exhibiting or demonstrating personal leadership, a desire for change, for example. That's something from the point of view of often there are lots of people in a founder led business who have lots of ideas, but they've never had the opportunity to bring forward those ideas, right? And so it's a question of working through trying to understand and assess passion for change, interest in change, ability and an interest in working with data driven decision making. It goes back to kind of what we talked about earlier in terms of what are those cultural aspects, and you're trying to assess, and accountability is a huge one from the point of view of do people understand accountability, which is not about blaming people, it's about ownership of your commitments. So it's delivering on your commitments. It's about taking personal responsibility. So I think you have to look at kind of those behaviors. You're looking at those behaviors when you meet people. And so I think you have to structure your questions and in your meetings with people, with the management team around that to try and uncover that, because it's very hard otherwise to assess people's loyalty.
Again, a sort of nice segue into, phase three, which is really around that value creation then and driving that growth. We often talk about businesses outgrowing their leadership. How do you identify when a high performing leader, up until this point, has really reached their limit then in a fast growing scale up at the point of then really driving that value?
So if we're thinking about this at the executive team level, I think the key thing is whether the expectations are set for those individuals from the point of view of if you have a set of expectations in terms of, for example, the CEO, and if those are defined from the point of view of scaling leadership, then you have a framework to evaluate an individual, a CEO, against from the point of view of whether they are spending their time on the right issues, the right areas. So I think if you have that framework, it becomes much easier from the point of view of creating feedback that says that someone is not has maybe reached their capacity. And their capacity is driven by their ability to learn, adapt, and develop, right, as an individual. So I think that as long as you've got measurements, performance measurements at an individual level, then you have a way of providing feedback and assessing whether someone has kind of plateaued, right, for example. And if they can't scale, whether it's scaling their decision making or because they simply don't like to operate at that level. A lot of founders, for example, sort of they're what gives them energy around starting and growing businesses. They reach a point where they just aren't interested in managing a big organization because they do less and less of what they love doing every day. And then again, this comes back to it's not about good or bad people, it's about people who are right for that phase of the business. So it's about having this is where the HR function or HR leadership in a business really is really important from the point of view of being able to kind of set those expectations, measure against those expectations performance wise, and then identify if someone still has the potential to grow further or if they have reached a level where they're kind of optimal, right, from their own personal performance point of view. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, definitely. In establishing the key criteria around that, would you say it's, the earlier the better? So this should be really clear within the first 3 months, or is it something that almost has to evolve and emerge throughout the value creation phase?
I think this has to be done right at the beginning, right? Right. From the point of view of when I look at role, I think of the first question I've got is there a job description for this role? That's the first thing does that exist? And they come in various, it may be a very well written job description or a very general job description. But then I think to support that is kind of a mandate, which sort of goes to another level of these are the 6, 7, 8 key priorities for this role. And that turns into kind of then a personal plan for that executive or individual, that leader, in terms of how they're going to go about accomplishing that. So I think when those are in place, they really need to be in place at the beginning because you have to set this tone at the top, this accountability at the top with the CEO. It has to cascade down into the organization with the same, so that the ripple of expectations and accountability and, are flow through the organization so that everyone is clear that this is how the business will be run. And that ultimately will change the culture of the company from the point of view of how it operates, how it behaves, how decisions are made.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you. And you talked about, you touched on innovation, creativity, the fact that, what maybe energize a founder initially might not so much as they move into the next stage as well. How do you transition a scale up from that sort of messy entrepreneurial chaos and, thriving on ambiguity and creativity to P level accountability without stifling some of that creativity and innovation?
So that's an area that I like to sort of play in myself because I think it's so important because you have investors who are perhaps deal people who don't really understand how businesses run, right? And you've got the management team, they're the operators. I do believe that organizationally there is kind of if you like, a capacity for change in those organizations, right? And so it's a question of gauging that capacity and moving as fast as the organization can without impacting the performance of the business. So I think that having these kind of clear expectations for reporting and cadence KPIs and board ready material, it's important for the organization or the leadership to understand that's the ultimate expectation. And then the question is, work with the management team to put together a plan to get there as fast as possible from the point of view of adapting. But you have to engage. You're balancing speed with not causing adverse business performance at the same time. So I think that's where there's a certain amount of art as well as science from the point of view of how fast can you affect these changes? Because there is a capacity to absorb these kind of changes that it varies from company to company.
You touched on culture and that there's, an inevitable shift and change that's going to take place around culture. Is culture a nice to have or a financial driver?
So I think so. First off, it exists, and the question is, what is the culture? And for me, it's about how do people behave and how do they make decisions. That's what I look at from the point of view of the culture. I think I look at it as generally as it's a huge opportunity to develop a stronger culture from the point of view of at its core, accountability, trust. There's a whole list of empowered employees. So there's a whole set of things that in my mind make up a stronger culture from the point of view of being resilient and being able to deal with unforeseen business situations and so on. So absolutely, I think that culture is a huge opportunity that can drive faster execution, can help companies retain people. And I do believe that if you look at positive outcomes, you will more often find a stronger culture than a weak culture. And in the world of private equity, where there's a timeline on their investment, there's a duration that they want to be invested in the company before they sell it, because of that's what they do. Time is the enemy from the point of view of getting the team in place, developing a stronger culture, which I do absolutely can then drive a better outcome, right? But it's all about moving as fast as you can, because there is ultimately an exit that is anticipated by the investors at some point in the future, whether that's 5-10 years.
Thank you. Last question on thinking about value creation. Beyond the C-suite, how important do you think it is for PE firms to be focusing, perhaps more than they are at the moment, on the next tier of leadership during the growth phase?
Well, first off, that it's absolutely critical, because if you put a high-powered leadership team on top of a weak kind of management team, middle management team, you will get chaos. It'll break the middle management team. And I think that if you go back a few years, I think you would have found, Ellie, that private equity firms tended to focus on hiring the CEO, maybe the CFO as well. And then it's the CEO's problem to go fix the team. And I think firms have learned, and it's a different situation today, but it still can be improved from the point of view of recognizing that the more you get into understanding the bench strength in the next layer or two layers down in the management team, it's really speaks to the ultimate success, right? And also knowing how fast you have to move and what the mandate is for the CEO, right? From that point of view. So the more diligence that's done on the next level to understand that, I think ultimately saves time, and ultimately that will drive better performance. So I think it is. I think it's really, really important that through the diligence phase, there's an understanding of that. And then in terms of the first 100 days, to go to validate, kind of that diligence, and then figure out what has to be done. Because again, often if you've got a brand new CEO coming into the company, they are starting at kind of they're starting off behind the investors who don't have the advantage of having them done the diligence. So that's why the diligence kind of pre-phase, and then in the initial phase of the business, understanding the people and the capabilities and the gaps, and the weaknesses and the cultural improvement opportunities are absolutely critical, because it's all about, Ellie, the power of compounding. It's kind of like a compounding growth rate on your human capital from the point of view of what can they achieve in a fixed time. And the faster, the quicker you get that team in place and performing optimally, you're going to generate more value in the future. That's why it becomes so important.
So actually really investing time in thinking about the bench strength and capability coming through at the due diligence phase would be the ideal.
It'll be ideal if you assume, for example, that if you take an investment for 10 years, it's probably not. It's probably 5 to 8 years. But if you think about having a mistake with the CEO hire, for example, that then takes a year or 18 months to adjust for that. You've lost 18 months of early growth potential in the business out of 5 years. It makes a massive difference to the exit and to the outcome if you don't have that team in place and kind of functioning at the beginning. So the earlier that's done, recognized, and the sooner that those adjustments are made, it has a compounding effect, I believe, on kind of outcome and enterprise value.
So, as you move into exit readiness, in your experience when a business is sold, how much of the valuation is actually based on the quality and depth of the management team versus the balance sheet?
So I think you're probably not surprised that it's, for me, it's a significant part of that valuation, because I think it can make the difference between sort of average price and a premium price for the value for the business. And I think when investors are looking at companies, they're looking at the future performance. If you look at what people pay, often it's a multiple of the EBITDA of the business, of the cash flow from the business. So essentially, they're paying for future performance of the business. And critical to that is the management team, because they do not want, they're buying the management team. They do not want to buy the company and then, replace all management, right? If it's a good team. So it's a huge part of the valuation, from the point of view of really they're underwriting this management team, and so they become an important part of that value, right? Because of what
Yeah.
they're buying.
Yeah. And sort of broadening out from just thinking about leadership and the strength of that leadership team, why is it no longer enough for PE firms just to fix the finance? Why is a human capital proposition now a competitive advantage for a fund?
I think there was a time, and there still are sometimes, when financial engineering or re-engineering of a business or combination of businesses was sufficient to generate sufficient return for investors, that they didn't have to get more involved. I think that this is reflected as well in the fact that boards, are no longer meeting just quarterly, showing up, receiving a report and going home. Boards are far more, and directors are far more active and engaged because they recognize there's a competitive advantage to that. So I think that growth, at the end of the day, the growth and scalability of a business, and otherwise, the kind of the outcome, the exit here, depends upon those people. And if you think about a limited time period, Ellie, and the kind of the cost of having to replace people, right, and having a team that is in transition, the longer that goes on, that impacts the outcome. So I think that growth and scalability depends on, obviously, on the management team, and that bench strength speaks to resilience. It speaks to the ability to handle rough times or bad performance, right? All of which are competitive advantages when it comes to a business against competitors in that industry, with an investor looking for a great outcome.
And how do you help, in your experience, how have you best helped a management team prepare their people story alongside, finance, commercial, tech, so that they come across as a source of confidence, not a source of risk to an incoming buyer?
So I think that I would say that people are more recognized now that companies being bought and sold and transitions are part and parcel of everyday life. So there is no certainty anymore of joining a company and spending your life with that company. That's kind of gone. I think that in terms of working with management teams, one of the key elements for the CEO, CFO, maybe other members of the ELT, is that exit readiness is day one, so that this is part of the expectation setting for the CEO and management team is they need to understand the time horizon, roughly a range of when the investors would like to exit. And that drives then the value creation plans within that kind of time frame. So from the point of view of the employees, it's not that they necessarily need to know all of those details, but there's got to be a long range plan and annual budgets and forecasting that have that kind of that context of the exit. But if the organization is culturally learning, developing, growing, succeeding, everyone will benefit from that, right? And so that's important to keep the employees, the management team focused on performance, right? That's kind of the most important thing. You don't want an organization that is worrying about its future. The best way to mitigate that worry is to be successful, because then good things will happen, right? From the point of view of the company. Does that help? Hopefully that kind of answers your question.
Yeah, I wondered whether there was also a specific way in which the people story was articulated.
So I think there's very, very important is that the CEO will typically be the leader of kind of vision and mission for the business, right? So that there's got to be, in the same way as there's a compelling investment story for the investors, there's got to be a compelling employment and purpose story for the employees. So it's kind of the other side of the same coin, if you like, from the point of view of there has to be strong culture of setting out this vision of where the company wants to go, and then translating that into sort of having a strategy of how to get there. And that sort of translates into plans that everyone in the management team is bought into, committed to, from the point of view of having a believable, realistic plan to get to that better place, that growth place, right? And so that story becomes for the CEO something that is probably a daily story that they have to develop and share. It's not something that you put out on a PowerPoint slide once and then you're done. This is kind of a constant reminder of where the longer term of where the company's going, how the company's growing, how everyone is contributing to that growth. That story becomes really, really important. And then the financing becomes, and the kind of the ownership of the company becomes less of a concern to people, because they know they're in a valuable enterprise.
Yeah. And when it comes to a prospective buyer looking at that, you're saying that by having all of that in place, it helps to de-risk, and it helps to maybe bolster the financial side of the business and give them more confidence.
Absolutely, because when an investor is when you're buying a company, you've got a number of different risks. You've got kind of the business model. Does the business model, does the company make money? You've got business model risk. You've perhaps got macroeconomic risks. There could be regulatory risks. But one of the key elements here for any buyer is, what is the execution risk? The inability to execute against the strategy and plans. That comes down to the team. So the team is directly related to the quality of the team is directly related to execution risk, right? From the point of view of, and they're buying this company, they're buying the leadership team. So understanding that execution risk and understanding the need to upgrade, replace, add to the talent pool becomes really, really important. And that important to point out, Ellie, that additional cost will come out of the profitability of the go forward business. So that has to be factored in, at the outset, right? Because it's also going to be factored in at the exit.
So in your view, what does a perfectly prepared leadership team look like on the day of exit?
On the day of exit, the team, if you think about you walking into a company and what you'd expect, right? It's kind of, I think it's fairly fundamental from the point of view of, there's a clear mission from the point of view of direction. All the team has to have clear roles and responsibilities. I know it sounds very basic, but I'm still amazed at the number of companies that don't have job descriptions, or people's roles and responsibilities are not clear. And I always, I typically use a sports analogy from the point of view of, if a team runs out on the football pitch and you've got 3 goalkeepers, you're in trouble, right? If 3 people think they play goalkeeper, you're in trouble. So clear roles and responsibilities, right, are absolutely key. Having that strong bench strength, which means capable people, but in growing positions who have still got potential to grow themselves, that's kind of the definition of bench strength. I think when you've got those roles and responsibilities and you've got that bench strength, the next thing that I would say is really that the incentives are aligned, that the reward structure, how people are paid, how they're incented, has to be aligned with that from the point of view of they're working together, they're on a team. You haven't got misaligned incentives. And ideally, those incentives are also aligned with investors, with the board and investors. And I'd say the last thing, that your perfectly prepared team, they got a track record. They've got a proven track record of performance. Goes back to what I said about forecasting and ability to forecast, but they've got a proven track record of execution, of delivering against plan. In other words, the team itself builds trust from the point of view of predictable performance without relying on a founder or a small group of individuals. So that's kind of perhaps a little longer than you wanted, but that's kind of, for me, what a well-prepared team is.
Great. Thank you. And thank you so much for your time and all of your insights today.
That's a pleasure.
Just a couple more questions before we close. From what you know of People Edge and our services, how would having better tools and insights on culture and talent have changed your first 90 days?
I think that it would have accelerated decisions around people, because it would have identified gaps. If we could identify those gaps faster, and I think if we had a clearer view of the talent, we could have moved in the organization to get these decisions made, and less perhaps trial and error with people. And I think that's kind of what that translates into. Compounded over time has a massive impact, right? Because it means that the company could be more competitive in the market faster. It can grow bigger in the time frame that the investor is looking, more profitable, more valuable in the time frame that the investor's looking at. So I definitely think that more information, in this kind of understanding of the culture and the people would accelerate decisions, which just means, a greater outcome.
What, in your experience, is the People Edge, that unique human factor that separates a 2 times return from a 5 times return, would you say?
So I think the answer is that you have to have alignment of the right people with the right capabilities and a clear value creation plan. That is what is kind of really, really critical. That would then set up execution, which can create a great outcome. Create a great outcome instead of a good outcome. Said otherwise, right people on the bus in the right seats with a good roadmap plan. I think that's what the human factor is here.
Brilliant. Well, thank you so much for your time and insights today. Really appreciate it.
That's a pleasure, Ellie. I think this is really important work. I think there's a real need for this. It's still, I think, a real area of opportunity. There are some people who get this and some firms that get this, but there's still, I think there's still a lot of opportunity. So good luck with this.
Very validating to know. Thank you.